our next speaker, who has done incalculably important work on this particular topic, among many others. His name is Roger Robinson. He formerly served with great distinction as the Senior Director for International Economic Affairs under President Reagan, after service as a Vice President of the Chase Manhattan Bank and a Special Assistant to its Chairman for many years, David Rockefeller. Roger Robinson is these days the Chairman of the Prague Security Studies Institute, based, of course, in the Czech Republic. He is also the President and founder of RWR Advisory Group. I commend to you his Intel Track product there, which allows you to monitor what China and Russia are doing in the way of investing overseas, including here. But he has also been extraordinarily impactful, I think, both in his own right and in presentations that he's made now twice before at threat briefings of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. We're very pleased to have him with us. Roger Robinson.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back before the committee. I think you've already heard some rather stunning revelations here today from Representative Jim Banks, from Kyle Bass, Speaker Gingrich, the works of Senator Rubio, who's been a consistent, dogged advocate of change on this subject, as well as Senator Shaheen. And I think it denotes that we're building critical mass. And that's going to be essential on both sides of the aisle, because, again, this is the farthest thing from a partisan issue. This is all of our money. I don't know quite how many Americans are in the U.S. capital markets, but let's just say something in the neighborhood of 180 million. And this is really the nub of the problem. I mean, this is our money. This is not an abstraction. This isn't turning it over to somebody else for their responsibility. All of us have fund managers. All of us have financial planners. They may be faceless. You may not have a clue as to what's in your pension funds or mutual funds or index-derived funds. But believe me, it's worth finding out, because I can tell you, as you've already heard, those investments in Chinese companies are not just benign commercial entities. Many of the Chinese companies involved, and we'll get to the Thrift Savings Plan debacle shortly, but if we just take, for example, the MSCI All-Country World Index. Now, this is the particular index that's going to be used to benchmark the international shares of the Thrift Savings Plan, which is a $578 billion retirement system for the federal government and the American military that handles the funds of some 5.7 million of our federal citizens, federal employees. Now, mind you, this is not private money. Obviously, this is taxpayer money. So let's differentiate right now between private capital and our taxpayer capital. And that's what makes the Thrift Savings Plan, which is the focus of today's session, of a much larger set of issues, as Kyle Bass in particular pointed out. But we need to do something now on that score, because this decision by, there's a long name for it, by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which I just will call in shorthand the TSP Board, the Thrift Savings Plan Board, for ease. They've made this decision for market-related reasons, to capture more companies in the investable universe of federal employees, sort of a technical, liquidity-oriented and yield-oriented set of considerations, which normally is the stock and trade, if you will, excuse the pun, of fund managers. But this time, When you go into emerging markets and away from developed countries where they are safely today, you encounter not just Chinese companies, but in some cases, national security and human rights corporate abusers. Now, let me give you just a couple of quick examples. When you sign on to the MSCI All Country World Index, you're forcing those federal employees who want some international exposure, which is a normal diversification strategy, almost under any circumstances, but this time they'll only have one choice, which is, again, a fund benchmark against that index, which happens to include a PLA-affiliated company called Aviation Industry Corp. What do they do for a living? Well, they produce a range of military aircraft, including fighters and UAVs, ship-launched anti-ship missiles, not very helpful for our Navy in the South, patrolling the South China Sea, trying to keep that waterway open and away from the fortresses that they've militarized on those illegal islands. It has been sanctioned by the United States on no less than 5 occasions for proliferation concerns. Now, if the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and our combatant commanders around the world should happen to choose international exposure as part of their Thrift Savings Plan, their own dollars will be supporting that company, not to mention the ones that I'll mention next. But you can see the irony here and the dangers unfolding. China Mobile, another one. 15 base stations constructed in the Paracel and Spratly Islands, including signals intelligence facilities and the like. You have the U.S. Federal Communications Commission that denied China Mobile its application to provide telecommunications services in this country because the company, quote, raises substantial national security and law enforcement risks, unquote. That's a federal government determination. Well, you can see what's going to happen to the chairman of the FCC when they discover in his portfolio or her portfolio, I confess I don't know the name off the cuff, but wouldn't it be ironic if there was that inconsistency with that individual's money? In the case of human rights, you'd have the privilege to invest in, unwittingly, and on an undisclosed basis, Hike Vision Digital Technologies. Gee, what do they do for a living? Well, they're fundamental to what's called China's technological totalitarianism, the digital surveillance state. There are other terms of art being used for this. They are arguably the world's largest producer of security and video surveillance equipment, cameras, facial recognition technology, and the like. And you can see their cameras. They're deployed every few meters on the top of the walls of the concentration camps incarcerating 1 million or more. Some estimates are 2 million, 3 million. Uyghurs, of the type that you can see from space. The same is true with the Tibetans at railroad stations who are picked up and detained by the facial recognition equipment of this company. Does Nancy Pelosi, who cares passionately to her credit for the plight of the Tibetans, have in mind her retirement dollars underwriting the suppression and the incarceration of those human rights of Tibetans that she champions? I don't think so. If you're looking for bipartisanship You're seeing it right there. Let's move on. ZTE, practically a household name. I mean, how many times have they been sanctioned? They are a major U.S. sanctions violator. They have inappropriately shipped in particular to North Korea, but elsewhere as well. And the president had to save them from being put out of business when we were going to withhold all components to ZTE. But they are barred by federal agencies from any kind of procurement. So tell me, what are they doing or going to be doing if this decision's not reversed by the Thrift Savings Plan in the portfolios of the Congress, the executive branch, our uniformed military, our civilian military? What about China Unicom? What do they do? Well, they're the North Korea's sole internet service provider. They produce signals intelligence facilities or equip them in the South China Sea. CCCC, China Communications and Construction Corporation. They dredged the illegal islands in the South China Sea, and the list goes on. Now, mind you, this is a sampling. But we need some texture here, because we've got to bring this thing to life. And we've got to understand that decision makers, policy makers in our country are going to be directly implicated here, whether they're human rights champions or whether they're part of the national security community of this country. So, the bigger problem is what's Kyle Bass and others have described here that's happening. There's $1 trillion of Chinese dollar-denominated bonds in our markets. There's probably up to $1 trillion or more of equities, that is, stocks. And there are over 700 Chinese companies in our markets. You know, they shop for the laxest regulatory regime. There may be only 86 to 100 or so in the New York Stock Exchange, maybe 65 or so in the NASDAQ. Over 500 are in the under-regulated, putting it generously, over-the-counter market. People can't even tell you what the over-the-counter market is, practically. Some folks don't even consider it part of the U.S. cap markets. But it's a fabulous free lunch program for China. But the greatest deal that they ever saw in their collective lives in Beijing are the indexes, or the indices. I don't know which one people prefer. But I like indexes because it keeps that index name freshly on people's mind. Let's take the FTSE Russell index. What did they do in June? Well, they purchased out of the A-share market, which is right out of the mainland, Shenzhen and Shanghai exchanges, 1,097 Chinese companies, so that they could go viral, that they could instantly be moved into every healthy cell of the American body politic. What about the Bloomberg Barclays Global Aggregate Index, a bond index? I wonder how many funds under management they control. The answer is $54 trillion. So when they buy Chinese sovereign bonds or Chinese corporate bonds, read state-owned enterprises, boom. Instantly, those entities receive a massive windfall courtesy of the American people. And mind you, bonds, we should remember, I give you this piece of paper with a maturity date written on it and an interest rate, and you give me discretionary cash that I can use as I alone deem indicated. Let's remember what bonds are and not get caught up in in lingo here. Let's understand the fundamentals of what we're talking about here. Free cash flow. And we've already heard about the fact that the Chinese are receiving preferential treatment to our own companies. Dodd-Frank non-compliant, no auditing of the type that is required for American firms. How does that work? Let's talk just Russia just for a moment here. They've got about 25 companies in our markets. Big difference from China, right? And where are 24 of them? Over-the-counter market again. Love that non-transparency, you know, to blur the picture. Isn't it interesting that 7 of the 24 there are under U.S. sanctions currently? Now catch this, you can't do business with them with a 100-foot pole, right? That's the idea. But you can invest in them. You can fund them. You can give them all of the prestige of being in the world's most prestigious capital markets, all of the multipliers and legitimatization that they could ask for. Is this just bad luck on our part? Is this just, well, we kind of missed that 40 to 60 trillion of funds under management over here and trying to make those consistent with the notion of U.S. sanctions? Or was there something more deliberate afoot? You know, protecting Wall Street, protecting the cap markets, making sure that we focus on the shiny object of trade. It's important, but China can play that game all day long. When's the last time any of you, and those going to see this video for that matter, when's the last time any of you heard about the national security and human rights dimensions of China's corporate presence and sovereign presence in our cap markets, in our capital markets? Gee, that's funny. Never. Not one article, not one cocktail party, not one hearing, not one interagency meeting in the executive branch. I just want that to settle in for just a moment. Could it be that that's where Beijing lives and dies, is the money? That's where the Soviets lived and died, was the money. It's when, believe me, I was there and an integral part of this, it's when we went after their hard currency cash flow. It's when we went after the credits, both government and private sector. It's when we had the Saudis pump 2 million barrels of more oil a day and we decontrolled prices at the wellhead, took oil down to $10 a barrel because of the paltry $32 billion a year that the Soviets made in hard currency income in 1982. Was going to be, devastated, because every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil was a $500 million to $1 billion hit for the Soviets. In those days, the subterranean problem, if you will, was natural gas. Nobody heard of pipeline politics. The Soviets wanted to dominate Western Europe's natural gas markets, and I'm getting to the analogy here, believe me. They were going to take, with the Siberian gas pipeline fully subscribed, they were going to take Western Europe 75% plus dependent on Soviet natural gas. Now, a few of us, myself and Bill Clark and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, realized that even though they had never used natural gas and weaponized it before, they would if they could, that's for sure, and splinter NATO in a way that makes today's situation look like the Elysian Fields. And that's why we took the stand that we did. That's why we put a limit and had blood all over the floor in the alliance in so doing on the level of dependency that we were going to permit Western Europe to have on Soviet natural gas deliveries to 30%. We're dealing with Nord Stream 2 today. The president himself has called Germany kind of a wholly owned subsidiary of Moscow because of natural gas sales. How would the president feel if it was 75 to 80% dependent, which is exactly where it would be had there been no Ronald Reagan? Now, how does this relate to China? Well, it's not natural gas that's subterranean. It's the trillions of dollars that they're putting in Chinese securities into our markets. So that 3 years from now, they're moving that money in and creating their own dependency to such a degree that 150, 180 million Americans are going to wake up 36 months from now, and they're going to look at their investment portfolios and their retirement accounts and their pension funds, and you know what they're going to find? 15%, 17%, 22% of their total portfolios are Chinese securities. What happens then? I'll tell you what happens. It's called checkmate, because that becomes a China lobby of vested interests that's going to oppose any kind of sanctions or penalties against China because of fear of damage to the value of their portfolios. We think of the strength of the China lobby today in American business and how influential they are, and they are. That's Mary Poppins next to what we're talking about. And the Chinese counted on the fact that this session would never be held, that this kind of awareness, this burgeoning movement, bipartisan, wouldn't happen. They can't afford it to happen, and they assumed that Wall Street and other fund managers would protect them on infinitum, unwittingly perhaps, but nevertheless, they could execute this plan. So there's more to talk about, but I would urge you to understand. This battle of the Thrift Savings Plan needs to start for everyone in this room and everyone listening today. We cannot permit the companies that I just recounted to you, who they are, who they really are, what they do, the insidious nature of their activities, both as national security and human rights abusers. They cannot be in the portfolios of our military men and women. They cannot be in the portfolios of the cabinet, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our combatant commanders, and too many others to name. That 5.7 million federal employees paid for with our money. We have to have that decision reversed now. And I'll just say that the executive branch, right up to the president, is going to have to engage, because otherwise, that 40 to 60 trillion is okay with this happening in the terms that I'm mentioning. No reversal, just let her go. Well, my closing comments to you are not on my watch and not on your watch. This is our money. Thank you.